Welcome to the What Lies Beyond Halloween special with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today's guest is Dr. Cal Cooper. Callum is a chartered psychologist with the British Psychological Society, holding postgraduate degrees in psychology, social science research methods, and education. He has a long-time association with the University of Northampton and is based there as a senior lecturer in psychology. He also conducts research on, amongst other things, death and bereavement and parapsychology. In tonight's Halloween edition, Cal and I discussed a number of suitably spooky topics. We talked about Cal's early experiences as a ghost hunter and his move into professional psychology and parapsychology. We talked about classic ghost hunters, some of the interesting results from Northampton's parapsychology experiments, and finished up with phone calls from the dead. So light your jack-o'-lantern, hang up your rubber bats, kick back and enjoy this foray into the unknown. When did we first meet, Cal?
It was in 2009 in Nottingham, at the University of Nottingham, at a Society for Psychical Research conference.
Yes, it was. It was that long ago. It's quite frightening, isn't it? But
And you haven't changed a bit, just the addition of a false moustache.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So I keep thinking I look like Basil Fawlty with this, but there we go. Why did you become interested in parapsychology?
I think there were a few things that interested me growing up with regards to it, and that was local books regarding hauntings that were written by Jane Peters. These were in Ashfield, so it was giving stories of Kirkby and Ashfield and Sutton and Ashfield, an area of Nottinghamshire. And I would read these at the local library when I was down there with friends from school, and they were part of the heritage shop. So they were just a very basic pamphlet, laminated cover and stapled together. But all they were a series of interviews from local people. So I found that fascinating that these could be very honest and sincere accounts. They certainly read that way. And I knew of these places as well. I could walk past them. I could go into some of these pubs and buildings. I was fully aware of them. So to hear these stories of unusual experiences people had, but they seemed to be, so genuine in what they were telling and just couldn't understand what was going on, I thought this was fascinating. There's also Newstead Abbey just down the road from me as well. My grandmother took me for picnics there quite frequently. It's the former home of Lord Byron the poet and the Byron family. And so I heard tales of the White Lady and Bosun the dog and the Goblin Friar. And that too also fascinated me. I'd also looked into the Osborne Book of Ghosts and a few other things in the library. There was only like 5 or 6 books, and they were more inclined to be Fortean-based phenomena. So I saw the classic screenshots of the footage of Bigfoot and the classic Loch Ness Monster photograph and UFOs, or is it a cloud, and all these kinds of unusual experiences people had. And there are a few little bits here and there mentioning Harry Price, Jeff the Talking Mongoose, his investigation of that on the Isle of Man, and Borley Rectory being the main thing that I knew him for. So this all fascinated me. And of course, I love Ghostbusters as well. That really influenced me going up, particularly Ghostbusters 2. That was one that my mother had recorded for me off the TV on VHS tape with all the adverts at the time in. So years later, I was still seeing these adverts and how much they'd changed for Have You Got Your Mortgage with the Alliance and Leicester and advertised by Fry and Laurie, or it was the Famash Get Smash adverts with the Smash robots, or the milk bottle advert where they danced down the road. There was all kinds of cool things like that. So I've got all these lovely memories. I was going into acting and performing arts. That's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to be in theatre performance. And when it came to going to university, there were so many people of my age going down the route of doing drama and theatre studies or music or filmmaking, but just en masse. I thought, if this is my college alone looking for positions at university and that many people are going off to do a drama degree, and how many universities there are, there's near 120 20, 30 in the UK alone. You know, a degree isn't going to guarantee you anything in any field. It's how you apply yourself and often being in the right place at the right time. So I thought, why not do psychology? Because you could apply that to a number of things. It could be a very helpful degree. Certainly, even for performing arts, understanding human psychology could really help. But I discovered, because of there being more ghost hunting shows at the time and mentioning parapsychologists, that there's a whole study there. So I started to seriously look into it, discovered there were some universities doing it as a taught module within a psychology curriculum. And so those were the focus of going to open days. I went to Liverpool Hope University. I went to Hertfordshire and spoke to Richard Wiseman. I went to Coventry when they had a master's program in parapsychology at the time. Even Nottingham Trent, that has David Wilde there, who's interested in out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. But I settled for the University of Northampton, and that's where I've stayed ever since.
Oh, brilliant. It's so interesting that you talked about sort of local ghost story pamphlets, because that was one of the things that sparked my interest when I was a very young kid too. So, and a teenager actually. We used to go to Cornwall, and there was a publishing company called Bossony Books that had a lot of books by Peter Underwood, who is a veteran ghost hunter, and it was full of these sort of anecdotal accounts of spooky encounters. And of course, Peter Underwood was very interested in. You mentioned Harry Price and Borley Rectory, so that was very. He was very interested in that and involved with the investigations. I think he wrote a book with Paul Tabarry called
Mm.
The Ghosts of Borley, sort of assessing Harry Price. So your interest with Harry Price, who early 20th century ghost hunter, that's been quite persistent, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think he's very much a romantic character in all of the history of this. Certainly, when you turn to the ghost hunting community and those that have actually dabbled with the books and wanted to know what on earth they're actually doing with their time, they would be fairly familiar with people like Peter Underwood, Andrew Green, as well, and Harry Price. I don't think they realised the kind of lengths and breadths that some of these people went to. Harry's history is remarkable. He loved motor cars. His wife was a very well-off lady, and some would argue that she afforded some of his luxurious lifestyle as this director of the National Laboratory for Psychical Research, which was on the top floor of the College of Psychic Studies, still there to this day. Certainly the building across the road from the Natural History Museum in London, and the College of Psychic Studies was founded in 1881. The floor below was rented by Eileen Garrett and her family, the famous medium who emigrated to the United States and founded the Parapsychology Foundation in 1951. So she was there on site for Harry to get involved with some testing and seances at one point. But everything on the top floor was his library, it was his laboratory, it was seance rooms. There's only 3 or 4 rooms on the top floor, but he'd specially designed them so he got everything that he needed in each room to be working or interviewing or carrying out experiments. And seeing those pictures are beautiful. I recently got hold of volume 1 of the British Journal of Psychical Research, which he produced. I've got all 12 issues, which are very rare. And that was part of his falling out with the Society for Psychical Research, which was just down the road. He started writing more and more and being an international liaisons officer for the American Society for Psychical Research. So he was either writing in his own journal or he was writing for the American branch as well. But there were loads of things he investigated. So Borley Rectory, yes, that went on for ages. Some say that he died at his desk writing the 3rd installment. Steve Parsons has certainly said that there was a draft of notes that he was making for that. So he did at least 2 books on Borley Rectory. A second one being about the fact that it burnt to the ground and some of the legend that had lived on about the Nun's Walk and all the activity there. Jeff the Talking Mongoose on the Isle of Man. There was Joanna Southcott's box that she left with a note saying never ever open this box unless in a time of national emergency, and it can only be opened in front of 12 bishops and whatever else. And Harry making a big media story out of it and saying, well, the box just turned up on my desk one day when I walked back into the office. Where on earth did it come from? And you just think, you media hound, that this is all attention for the newspapers to get people either joining his national laboratory and paying a subscription or visiting or buying his books and paying attention to it. He did a book on Stella Cranshaw. He'd invested Cuda Books. a chap from India who claimed that he got X-ray vision and could see without the need for his eyes, and he could walk across hot coals. So that was Harry Price's first formal testing of firewalking and discovering that it wasn't a paranormal feat at all. There were no chemicals on his feet or anything, and the hot coals were measured to the temperature that they were produced at, and all kinds of things. Harry did a lot, even exposing Helen Duncan's ectoplasm by using infrared photography. He had an ingenious ghost hunting kit that included infrared photography and many other things, looking for all kinds of natural environmental factors. So, yeah, a really romantic figure. There's just such a big, big history to this guy. And the fact that he made his career for 2 or 3 decades out of this before, passing away untimely at his desk, he could have kept going, and he would have done. There are other figures like that who are good independent ghost hunters, and I think they're very, very romantic in terms of just what a lifestyle.
Yes, I mean, he was definitely a publicity hound, though, wasn't he? So I seem to remember a film of him on a German mountain with a goat trying to do a magical ritual to
Yeah,
change the goat into
the Brockenheim
was it a
experiment.
maiden or something? Yeah.
Brockenheim. So the first time it was he got an incantation to turn the goat into a prince, and it didn't work. And then the second time they used some very rudimentary camera editing, and it did turn into a prince. But no surprise for the listeners, it wasn't via any paranormal feats, just editing.
Yes, a bit of a shame. But so that inspired you to actually do some ghost hunting, didn't it? So what were your experiences there?
I don't know if it was entirely Harry, certainly Borley Rectory and what that meant. I'd also, and I didn't realise till years later, I'd been influenced by The Vertical Plane that was written by Ken Webster that included poltergeist activity. It's also known as the Doddleston Messages. It's being researched even to this day. Dr. Paul Rogers is working on that case again. But yeah, that just encouraged me to go out to local places. There were police officers that had claimed potential break-ins, but no sign of anything from the outside, that were also interested in unusual goings-on. And they were opening up places like Pleasyvale Mills, a former cotton mill in Mansfield, to the public. And I got quite a few private attendances there, where I got to go around with just a small group of people and spend all night and all day in that kind of property. So that fascinated me, and Clifton Hall as well, on the edge of the Clifton estate in Nottingham. And I'd be doing that for weeks and weeks and weeks. So you would just sit there, you'd have your sandwiches, you'd be walking about during the day, you'd have a notepad and pen, and that was it. Away you go. You just make notes of living with the building and just walking around all the time. At night time, you keep the lights on, but some rooms that just couldn't have electrical lighting, they didn't. You had got a lot of infrared in there, but so much so that the room was practically lit up on the camera. So just an absolute far cry from what you see in TV ghost hunting shows, with running around and the camera facing the face of the person filming and not what you should actually be looking at or what the camera should be looking at. So yeah, I suppose that was my first formal step into parapsychology, and that was around about 2002, 2003, 4, something like that. It was around that area. And I was starting to read the textbooks for parapsychology. Harvey Irwin's Introduction. I read Richard Broughton's The Controversial Science, and he was one of the first people I met when I joined the University of Northampton. So I was starstruck as someone that didn't particularly like reading at the time. Here I was meeting an author and a guy who's an actual parapsychologist. He's been there, done that, got the T-shirt, and now in his later years, he's joined the University of Northampton. So I found that absolutely fascinating. A lovely guy. Just saw him again recently. So that was my step into parapsychology. It was ghost hunting.
Did you experience anything on your ghost hunts?
A few things. I mean, you could go to a dozen locations and spend all night and all day there, and nothing would happen, except for the odd, if someone went along claiming mediumistic abilities, that they think that something had happened. But there were other instances where you get bored and you just start throwing bits of rubble off into a room because it's a room that's got nothing in it. It's due for restoration. And you just start chatting, and then all of a sudden you'd hear a bang, and then tap, 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 ting, 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 and it comes rolling all the way back over the room at you. But this is something that's like 30, 40 yards across. These are massive, massive rooms in mills, cotton mills, that would have housed looms. These are big, big rooms. You could play football in them. And yet this rubble has come back out of just a little shadowy area of the room, with there only being one door in and out, and you go, how has that made it all the way back across the room? And it's not even the same thing I threw. It's not fallen down. And you pick it up and you're like, oh, oof, it's red hot. Where's it got the heat from? There's no heating in this building. There's no radiators. Couldn't even hold it in my hand that long and make it that warm. Little things like that. There's more movements of objects, or there's some things. I remember we went to once. This was with police again. We went to it was like a community centre, family community centre you get in town where, you'd have function rooms and all sorts, but there was a kids' play area with a ball pond and all sorts, and climbing frame, netted area, and we were in there, and you just sit still, and balls would fly. And I don't mean because they're on top of the netting because someone's thrown them up there and they just fall down. You'd be sat there and one goes across, so sideways, past your face. And it would come, when you look at the direction it's come from an area of the room no one sat in. So you would never see the starting point. You would see the midway and the landing. And you're like, well, this is odd. I can understand something falling from the ceiling because it's on a rafter or something and you've just not noticed it. But falling sideways doesn't happen. That's a throw. So those were odd. Very odd.
Yeah, so I understand those kinds of experiences are quite subtle. The ones I've had, when I was a student, there was a flat that was allegedly haunted that I knew through some friends, and one night I was alone in the flat with a friend, and we were in the other room basically, but there's a candle illuminating the room we come from, so the room's empty, and then suddenly the light goes out, and we go into the empty room, and the bottle where the candle stood was completely empty. And my friend got quite annoyed because I kept saying, you're not having me on, are you? And yeah, and they weren't, because we were both in the same room. And apparently we actually found early next morning, because we were kind of up all night, a bit wired, student land. We actually found a book in the middle of another room that had been empty, and it hadn't been. Obviously, you've only got my word for it, but it hadn't been there. It just was there in the middle of the floor, and but they're quite subtle. So you could approach, say, someone who's critical or skeptical, and they'd say, "Oh, well, it could have been this, could have been that," and you could say, "Yes, it's not something you can prove," but it was very strange at the time. Yeah. So you went to Northampton, and you did your PhD and then a member of staff there. So you started doing experimental work in parapsychology as well. So that's the Ganzfeld sort of telepathy and psi experiments, and also remote viewing. So could you tell me a bit about how you got involved with that and what they were?
Yeah, I mean, I needed the I needed the extra money when I was studying as an undergraduate, and I was looking for anything that was coming up. If I could get work in parapsychology, that'd be great, but they're so few and far between trying to find a role in that. So I was doing even jobs when I was an undergraduate of working for Next, which is a clothing store, and I was vlogging the BT phone books, if anyone remembers those. I was going around places like Grantham with a friend, and we'd just fill a car up with these books and go from door to door, chucking the phone book through letterboxes, which no one has now, but anything to make extra cash. And as I say, Dr. Richard Blount was there. And it started off with him needing a research assistant for collecting data on psychokinesis. And we were looking at micro levels of this. So something you couldn't see with the human eye. You can't see, for example, for the people listening, on a micro level, if we're talking about a metal object like a spoon, if someone's applying with their mind an influence on the spoon to bend it, on a micro level, you wouldn't see any change to the spoon. But if it was wired up with piezoelectrical sensors and strain gauges to a computer, the computer could tell you if it's under any strain or deformation. On a macro level, absolutely, you'd see it with the naked eye. You'd see something's changing. We were looking on that micro level. So we're trying to see if a needle on an online game where you literally just click go and you try and see how far around the needle goes from a red zone to a green zone, could you in your mind's eye try and push it into the green zone? And it's wired up to a random number generator to see if there'd be a clear, distinct pattern against the random number generator. that is showing more in favor of the green. So you've got some consecutive green elements because you're trying to force it more and more and go against the random number generator. So essentially, your mind is trying to influence both the needle and override the random number generator that is just trying to provide a random sequence of where the needle will fall. So I was doing that, and it was a nice time as well because Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code had just come out as book and film, and it was talking a lot about parapsychological abilities within this kind of biblical landscape. So we had Sir Tony Robbins from Blackadder. It's Robbins, isn't it? It's not Robinson. It's Tony Robbins. Yeah.
I think it's Tony Robinson, actually.
Is it Robinson?
Yeah, because Tony Robbins is, I think, is the positive thinking person. So.
Oh, right. Well, there we go. Anyway, okay. we got Baldrick from Blackadder, and he came
brilliant.
And he came and met Richard, and it was really good. And he had a go at this experiment. He didn't get anything significant. He was just a chance scorer, but he was absolutely fascinated, and he was an absolute gentleman. And I literally went from doing that, and that's reminded me to go back through the records and see what Richard wrote up of that study. But we went from that to the remote viewing Ganzfeld. So what happened there were a number of studies that had taken place throughout the 80s and 90s, refining remote viewing procedure, where literally, again, that this is an aspect of clairvoyance, which is the ability to perceive information at a distance. People in parapsychology have been taking the military aspect of this, where you got a grid reference to work on, so just maybe 6 numbers, and someone would sit there and talk about colors and textures and shapes, and in your mind's eye, you know there's somewhere to focus on. Something is going to be the target at the end of the study. So can you, in your mind's eye, picture where that might be? And so in many ways, it hasn't happened yet. So we were looking at that procedure versus the Ganzfeld, which has been going since the late 60s and adopted into parapsychology in the 70s, where you're lying in a reclining chair, you've got eye shields on, half ping pong balls, and you look through those. They're taped to your eyes, and as you look through, there's a red light beaming down, so it creates this pink haze. And you've got headphones on, you listen to relaxation, where you've got to stretch your arms and legs, arch your back, release, and it's all about letting all this tension go, and then you just listen to white noise or pink noise, which is this reduced hiss. It's very calming, it's not intimidating at all. Anything you think or feel or hear during that time, you just say it out loud, and the experimenter records it. So we took this forward. So we've got this military technique and the Ganzfeld, and one person will go through and do both. On a flip of a coin, we decide which we do first, Ganzfeld or the military technique. And our safeguard from cheating and sensory leakage was the fact that every time they did this, even the computer had not selected where the location was going to be yet. They had to be done and signed off with their mentation. And then the computer would say, right, it's this location. And they'd be taken through to Professor Chris Rowe's office. They get to look on Google Earth as to what this location was, and they could go around. And Google Earth was pretty new at this time. This was 2008, 2009, and it just developed the technology where you could actually zoom down into locations or even see a ground view. And a lot of those ground views were based on the fact that people had digital cameras that were satellite linked. So you could sign up and agree to have some of your tourism photos be linked to Google. So people could get your ground view of different things. Like if you went to the Acropolis or you went to Rome or whatever, you got to see what a tourist would see. So it was very, very interactive of its time. And our participants really liked it. Of course, all of that was not the judging phase at all. All of that, what they said and what the location turns out to be, went off to an independent judge, and the judge would see 4 different potential locations. And they've got to match what they've said in the Ganzfeld to one of these 4 locations. So one's going to be the most likely to the least likely, and that's how the judging phase happens. And it was a big step. Chris had just done one pilot study where you got 2 people, one goes in the Ganzfeld and the other one goes off somewhere on campus, and they've got to think and feel in the Ganzfeld where their friend might be. So there's an agent involved, and that's how other remote viewing studies were done. They would usually send someone to the location. Can you think where this person is? It starts to become questionably, well, are you trying to focus more on telepathy because you know that person rather than the location? So using Google stripped out the need for there to be an agent. And this progressed into another study and then another study after that. And so Chris wrote them up as 4 studies that are now in a open access paper in the Journal of Parapsychology.
So were they successful?
Uh, all of them were. I mean, the pilot was successful, and that was just using Ganzfeld. It had a significant effect. The one that I was involved in, the military technique, no, it was just bordering on chance. Ganzfeld, yes. And then for the two that followed, exactly the same. Military technique, no, bordering on chance. Ganzfeld, yes. And this goes back to people like Jessica Utz, who said that 1 in 100 people are naturally good at this. So that makes sense with the bordering on chance for the military stuff,
Oh,
because
for the remote viewing technique.
yeah,
So
they self-selected people that were naturally good at ESP studies, and they worked with them more, just as J.B. Ryan had done in the early days of Duke University. But if you take anyone in a given population and stick them in a procedure that alters their state of consciousness, you seem to improve these chances. You seem to open up people's potential really well, where you're having a really good success rate, and maybe only what 20% of people might not be scoring very well at all within the Ganzfeld. You get average hit rates overall if you're working on this 4 possible outcomes and then being weighed up. You can have 38 to 45% hit rates, which
which is very high.
which
That's
is
well
really
above.
good.
So chance is 25%. So
Absolutely.
statistically, that's very significant.
Mm.
Really interesting there. So I think that's a crucial point about how this psi seems to manifest. So it seems to be very associated with altered states of consciousness, doesn't it? So the Ganzfeld is set up to mimic sort of something called hypnagogia, which is an intermediate state of consciousness between waking and sleep.
Yeah.
So you think the differences in the studies seem to confirm that link?
Yeah, it's something at the University of Northampton we've certainly pushed for a long time. It's been a massive interest of our research, and Chris Rowe has published a number of papers. There's a really good chapter in a book called Anomalous Experiences, Parapsychological and Psychological Perspectives, or Essays. It's edited by Matthew Smith, a good friend of you and me. And it was a summary of a conference that was done at the university, Liverpool Hope University, sorry. And Chris has a chapter in there called, I think it's Psi and Altered States or something like that, Anomalous Experiences and Altered States. And it summarizes study perspectives on inducing altered states and the impact this seems to have on psi performance. But you can relate it to day-to-day occurrences, which we call spontaneous phenomena, when people say they've had a premonition or they've encountered ghosts. Robin Woofit, who's a specialist in linguistics and qualitative analysis, he's noted this as a sociologist in his research. I was just washing the pots when I was out running an errand when all of a sudden I was watching my favorite TV program and engaged in laughter from all the comedy that I was watching. I looked up and I suddenly saw you're suddenly in this mindset of doing something very boring, mundane, not requiring a lot of concentration. You're in a sort of altered state, lost in the moment. Time flies when you're having fun, and then something happens. Put someone in the Ganzfeld, they're in there for an hour, and you ask them at the end, how long do you think that was? They'll go, oh, 4 or 5 minutes. So we can see time perception has altered. So they're clearly going through an altered state. Exactly the same when you go to sleep. It's very hard to tell how long you've been to sleep for unless you look at a clock. Sleep is an altered state of consciousness. Taking psychedelic reactants can cause an altered state. As you say, going to sleep and waking up, the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, they are altered states as well. And imagery becomes very vivid during those points, especially as to whether this is dream imagery or waking state imagery. You become very confused between the two. And so, absolutely, when they're in the Ganzfeld, we want them in that nice balancing state of not quite being awake, but not quite being asleep. So we are literally holding them in a unique altered state to try and get as good at imagery and impressions as we can.
Yes, it's so interesting. I like there's a primarily UFO researcher, Jenny Randall's term for sort of high strangeness experiences when people experience strange things. She calls it the Oz factor. So it's this sense that you're stepping a little bit outside the mundane world. And she found lots of evidence that when people experience very strange things, they do seem to enter this altered state. But so that's really interesting. It's interesting that you were actually able to get some positive results. Because a lot of the time, if you listen to critics, it's, oh, you can't replicate these things. You can do it once, but maybe, but you can't do it again. So it's interesting that you had a persistent effect there.
Well, I think we have to fire back the criticism or the comments they make, which is, exceptional claims require exceptional explanations. I'm like, well, show me the evidence for that. I've worked in parapsychology for a very long time, and I'm a trained psychologist. That's what I do first and foremost. And I've seen far better replication effects for parapsychology studies than I have for general human behavior. It's all over the place and inconsistent. It's like trying to nail jelly to the wall. It's very hard to do. But parapsychology studies seem to produce the effects that have been going on for decades. I think it was Caroline Watt in her presidential address for the Parapsychological Association. She'd said around 2005, 2006, the effects for parapsychology overall are good. In fact, in some instances, they're far better than other areas of psychology. Jessica Utts, for her presidential address for the American Statistical Association in 2015-16, she said the data is extremely strong and in favor of psi. When she asked statisticians, do you want to see more statistics in favor of psi, or do you want to hear one really fascinating anecdote? Most of them just want to hear the anecdote because they've seen the statistics. It seems statisticians are quite happy that the statistics are good. No one's fudging the data. They've got a very kind of routine way of dealing with the stats, especially when you go back to Rhine and dealing with Zener cards. That's a very, very basic probability calculation. It's very difficult to mess that up. You've got to be doing something very corrupt if someone's not calculating that properly. It's very pen and pencil-esque easy to do. I get my students to do it, and they realize how fun it is to actually realize where do you get a critical ratio from, and how do you look at probability. You can just pen and pencil it and understand how the numbers are working. So yeah, it's far better outcomes. I've always found it very strange when you hear the outside critics not doing the research but happy to eat the cake and not go into the effort of making the cake and then criticize how good the cake is or not. That that there's not many good effects, or you can't replicate that. What have you tried? I mean, is that from your own experience, or are you just saying words? Because that's not the experience on paper or the reality of it.
Well, yes, that's right. And I think with J.B. Rhine, that was back in the 30s, he actually got some statisticians to analyze his work, didn't he? And check for flaws.
That was how they started off. So when they were doing the initial Zener card studies, the statisticians at the university helped him devise how they would actually choose a certain route of probability. So that was all in the decision of having 5 cards. Only one of those symbols ever changed, and I think it was a triangle to a cross by Carl Zener, or Zener, as he's known. It's like with Broughton and Broughton. And so it was this decision of then there's going to be 5 of these in every pack. So that makes 25. So probability is 5 out of 25 by guesswork. And if you're working only with 25, then the standard deviation is 1. So you should still get 6, maybe 7 at a push by chance. But if you're doing 7 or more consistently, something else is going on beyond chance. And it starts to increase as you go up. So out of a run of 100, it's a standard deviation of 4. So you should be able to get 20 out of 100 by chance. Maybe 24, anything consistently over 24, something unusual is going on.
Yeah, so what amazes me is how much of an open secret these results are, because if you read, say, pop science publications like the New Scientist and whatever, or the BBC, you routinely get people saying there's no evidence for it at all. But it's a very frustrating situation that actually there is a body of very significant evidence for parapsychological effects that it's just, well, we're not quite sure what those are, so we're going to put it to one side. And it's difficult to know what more you can do, really.
Would you put that down to poor journalism, or just people not being interested to find out what they're writing about, which I think is careless?
I think it's got a lot to do with worldview. I mean, I've talked about this a lot with other guests on this podcast, actually. And as Lancaster I was talking to recently, and he thinks that a lot of the differences in consciousness studies are so down to worldview. So you can talk about evidence and data, but you're always going to be filtering how you understand the evidence and the data through your basic understanding of how the world works. And I think this is the problem, that things like psi don't fit into the particular ideas about how the brain, mind, and consciousness work. So I really do think it's down to that primarily. Okay, so let's move on a little bit, because you moved back a little to spontaneous cases, and I'd like to talk about your 2012 book, Telephone Calls from the Dead, because I think I reviewed that for the Journal of the SPR, and that was linked in with an earlier work, wasn't it, by two authors, Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayliss, called Phone Calls from the Dead. So can you tell me how you got involved in that particular subject?
I was reading a lot of their books as an undergraduate and while doing my other studies. And as I bought these books, I bought one that was co-authored by them instead of just one providing the foreword or a preface for the other. They'd done a lot of research together in spontaneous phenomena. They'd done early electronic voice phenomena research together, which is the spontaneous sounds, raps and bangs reappearing on purposeful recordings. So you go out and do a recording in a soundproof room, sometimes with a medium, expecting that impressions could end up on the tape, and so you get something on playback. So Raymond was doing that in the 1950s. Scott was born in 1950, so he started getting involved in this in the mid-60s, even in his middle teens. So one of his first articles came out in the Journal of Paraphysics, doing these tape recordings at the age of 15, 16. And it was by the 70s they were doing more and more of this, and they'd spoken to people about it, and clearly people were saying, oh, you're recording strange electrical sounds that you think are voices of the dead. Well, this might interest you. I've heard of a case of someone having a telephone conversation with someone known to be dead, or similar to that. They didn't pay any interest to it at first, and then more people came forward, so they decided to devote their time to just finding these cases. And between 1977 to 79, they found 50 cases in books, or reaching out to psychologists and other scientists, asking if they got such cases on file. Some had. I recently found some of these letters in the Cambridge archives, Cambridge University archives, where the SPR archive is, and also at the University of Virginia and the Division of Perceptual Studies, where Raymond Bayliss's material is. And that produced their book. They did an analysis of 50 cases. Some of them are unusual ones involving living individuals, but the majority are alleged contacts with the dead. So many years later, I still hadn't read this book. I bought it, threw it to one side, thought I might have a look at that later. There was a news report of a man called Charles Peck who was on the way home in California, who was on a commuter train, and it collided with a freight train, and there was a live rescue on TV. His family claimed that they were getting repeated calls from his mobile phone, and they were yelling, "Don't worry, Dad, the rescuers are coming." And when the phone went down, they'd call back and it just went to voicemail, as though the phone was dead or had been switched off. And then when it rang again, they'd just hear static, and it was his wife, his son, his daughter, all these close family members. And they were watching this live rescue, and by about 3 a.m., they found his body and the call stopped. And rescuers said, he's near the front of the train, he's died on first impact, and no phone was recovered. So for me, I just think, well, he's on his way home anyway. The call register is just calling the last people that he was talking to anyway, which would be his family if he's on the way back home. And it's been crushed, it's pressed against something, and it's just calling over and over the last people in the call registry until, the phone has actually died as well. But what was fascinating for me as a psychologist is the media called it a phone call from the dead. They pushed it as that. So really capturing the imagination of the reader. And the family took it as that, and they found it comforting. So I thought, is this how people are interpreting the calls? Or is there actually a conversation to be had? So I then started to read the book, Phone Calls from the Dead, to see what Rogo and Bayliss had found.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So what have Rogo and Bayliss found? Have they found cases that were more compelling than that, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So they got full-blown conversations in some instances. They found 4 different call categories. One was called simple calls. That's where someone has died and you get the telephone ringing, the closest one to you, not all the phones in the house, the closest landline to you, and it would have a reduced bell tone. You could pick it up and it sounds like the voice is hollow or in the distance, and they might just say a name. You don't hear the sound of the phone clicking back down on the receiver. Type 2 calls are prolonged. You don't know anyone has died, and you pick up a call from Mary. Mary talks to you for 15, 20 minutes. It's quite final in some of the things that she says about going away and a long journey, and I do love you, you know I love you, and all comforting words. And then phone goes down, knock at the door, it's David. Hi, David, how are you doing? David looks really upset. Well, what's up? Didn't you hear about Mary? Well, what? I've just been speaking to her on the phone. Well, you can't have done. She died in a car accident yesterday. I thought you'd know. What's going on there? So that's a prolonged call. Answer calls, type 3, that's where, again, you don't know someone has died, but you could ring them and yet they pick up and you still have a conversation much like the one I've just explained with Mary. Or someone isn't anywhere near the telephone. You don't know that, but you still have a conversation. It's their number, it's their voice, it's their knowledge. And yet later when you tell them about the call, they go, we never had that call. There are other people to verify that at the time you claim that you spoke to them, they were nowhere near a phone at the time the call took place. So who was
So
it?
that's not a telephone call from the dead.
No, that's
Or
just an
it's just
unusual one with the living. Just like then their fourth category that they had, which are intention calls, and that's where you intend to call someone. For whatever reason, you change your mind, and then allegedly the call still takes place. So Rogo's own classic example was, it was 10 o'clock on a bright Thursday morning, and I was thinking about making a call to a friend of mine at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. Although I thought about making the call, I never actually did. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, I got the shock of my life when a call came in from the office of the very psychologist I had thought about calling. It was their research assistant, and he said he was answering my message when I'd asked what in blazes he was talking about. He said that at 10 o'clock that morning, a call had come into them from me. The caller had left my name and my number and asked that the call be returned. So that's what those are like. You make the intention, you change your mind, and apparently for the people that were involved in your intention, they still get something, be it a telephone call. In other instances, that might explain apparitions of the living.
Now, I mean, these are superficially extremely strange. I'd say they're up in the high strangeness portion of the spectrum, if you like. So, what do you think is the best explanation for them? Do you think there's just one, or do you think there's several explanations?
I think the highest explanation is misinterpretation, especially, you've lost a son or a daughter. And there are so many instances I've heard of when they said, oh, I lost a son or a daughter, and I got this voice that kept saying, Dad, Dad. And well, hands up, how many people know someone called Dad? I mean, a lot of people do. Dad and Mum are very common names because that's what you call your own parents. And so, if you've lost a son or a daughter and there's a missed call from someone trying to call their mum or dad, and you go, oh, Mum, and they go, oh my God, and then grief suddenly comes down the telephone. The person who's called is like, oh my goodness, and they put the phone down without an apology, thinking, oh, I've got the wrong number. What? And it sounds like someone screaming down the phone. It's absolute grief and agony and pain.
So coincidence, basically.
In that instance, it could be, and the just two ends aren't tied together, and it's just unfortunate and mistaken. In other instances, people could be filling the gap of loss. There was a researcher called Robert Baker, I think it is. He did a book called Hidden Voices about auditory hallucinations, and he dedicated 2 or 3 pages to Rogo and Bayless's book, saying if someone is alone at home and they're grief-stricken, you could have a telemarketing company or someone trying to sell you a package for Sky and get TV programs. And he said maybe intentional amnesia. You fill in the gap of what you want to hear. You pretend it's your son or daughter bringing you comfort, and you just glaze over everything that they're saying. And afterwards, you've misremembered this intentional amnesia and thinking, I have had a communication of my lifetime, and I know that they're with me now. And so the brain is trying to help and soothe because it doesn't want you in a constant state of separation anxiety. It wants some connection. It wants some spiritual connection rather than nothing. And I say spiritual connection, not in a kind of non-measurable, non-tangible sense. We look at spiritual connections now very much in thanatology and bereavement research in terms of this cognitive continued bonds model. We connect an experience to how we're feeling, and what we feel about that experience. We sense a presence of someone clearly not present in the room.
Mm.
There's an impact there. How does that make you feel? We see an item that's fallen out of a drawer that's related to the deceased. How very coincidental. How does that make you feel? You smell a perfume or a tobacco related to the deceased. How does that make you feel? There's an impact factor for all of these things that the person may interpret as anomalous, whether it is or isn't. And it creates this continued spiritual bonds model where it's like their own little religion of continued attachments to the dead. And we found them to be highly beneficial, contrary to a lot of people saying, oh, it's not very good for people to believe in the afterlife, or mediums, they're just grief vampires. Look at the impact that the research shows. I've seen only one paper that has shown that these experiences could be negative, and that was one only with an elderly population. And looking at the reference list, they'd not acknowledged any of the major or key research that had been done in this area, at least not the Society for Psychical Research. It was a very poor paper and very poorly researched. And so when you look at the majority, you're like, wow, it's like a 2 percentile of people that seem to have a bad experience because they see a disfigured or grotesque apparition of the dead, not glowing and angelic and looking younger and healthy and vibrant.
So what you're saying is, whatever the source of these experiences, whether it's just anomalous psychology or whether it's something more, it's still psychologically significant and important.
Yeah, massively so. They're really important for our health and well-being and moving forward. But for the brief time that we have on this earth, it can be very, very hurtful to lose a loved one. So any kind of sense that, you're being watched over or they're nearby, I mean, that's also why you keep photographs around as well. You want to kind of keep memories alive because they're comforting. So if you believe you've had an experience that is exceptional, well, then good for you. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Why would you want someone to explain it away? We're not dealing with parapsychology there. We're dealing with clinical parapsychology. We're interested in how does it influence you, not where did it come from. That's a different matter.
Yes. And I think that's also a good place to think, since this is Halloween and we're winding up, this is a festival of the dead. But I think it's very important, that sort of element of remembrance and sense of connection is so psychologically important to people, I think. You've actually got a new edition of your book on this, and also Roggo and Baylis's old book has had a new edition as well, haven't they?
Yeah, so my book just went to a second printing because it'd been out of print for 5 or 6 years. I've just been so busy and I've not got around to doing it up again. So it is back out now. It came out in 2012, January 2012, and it's back out again. And it took ages to get the rights for Phone Calls from the Dead because Roggo and Baylis had two very different families, and Baylis didn't have hardly any family. He was abandoned as a child anyway. So his family circles are very, very small. But Meredith Roggo, one of the nieces of Scott Roggo, she now deals with his book rights. It's taken me ages, and I've had to hand write out the book again. But there is now a postscript by me, which brings up the research to date, where we are now with emails and text messages and iPhones. So, they're both out. So mine is with Tricorn Books, and theirs has been reprinted with White Crow Books. So there we go. They are back out, and they're in Kindle as well.
They're both available on Amazon, aren't they? So if anyone wants a copy, then they can get them there.
Please do.
So that's absolutely brilliant. Any final thoughts, Cal?
Oh, the world, isn't it a strange place? And I think it's mainly people that make it strange, not these strange goings on.
Yes, I think that's true.
Be more scared as it's Halloween. Be more scared of the living than of the dead. Seriously, folks.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen the movie, or the however many movies with Jamie Lee Curtis they've made anyway. So, well, that's really interesting. Fascinating talk, Cal. I'm sure people will find it interesting. And happy Halloween.
Yeah, happy Halloween, Matt. Thank you very much for having me.
What Lies Beyond with Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.